The coffee mug hit the stone patio and exploded into a dozen pieces. Brown liquid splashed across my bare feet, but I couldn't move. 3 men in yellow hard hats were walking across my property with a bulldozer rumbling behind them. The lead guy, Craig Mullins, our Homeowner Association president, was waving a red folder like it was some kind of victory flag. 10 minutes to pack your essentials, Norton, he shouted across my lawn. This structure is illegal. I'm James Norton, 57 years old, and I've been living in this guest cabin by Pinewood Lake for 3 years now. Ever since Sarah passed, the main house felt too empty, too full of memories I wasn't ready to face. This little place by the water, it saved my sanity. But apparently, it was about to be demolished. What the hell are you talking about? I called back, stepping over the broken ceramic. The morning air bit at my skin. I was still in yesterday's jeans and an old flannel shirt. I have permits for this place. Craig's smile was the kind you see on a used car salesman right before he tells you about the hidden fees. He was maybe 62, with the soft gut of a man who'd spent too many years behind a desk wielding small-town power like it was a medieval sword. Permits were revoked, James. Building code violations, height restrictions. He pulled out an official-looking document. Demolition order, signed by the county. You've got 10 minutes. The bulldozer operator, a thick guy with arms like tree trunks, revved the engine. The sound cut through the morning quiet like a chainsaw through silk. Have you ever felt the ground shift under your feet when you're standing perfectly still? That's what hit me in that moment. 3 years of rebuilding my life, and some bureaucrat with a clipboard was about to erase it with heavy machinery. Let me see that paper, I demanded, walking toward Craig. My neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, was already peeking through her curtains next door. By tonight, half the subdivision would know my business. Craig held the document just out of reach. All legal, Norton. Should have followed the rules from the start. The permit I'd gotten in 2019 was locked in my filing cabinet, 20 feet away inside the cabin they wanted to destroy. I'd paid for surveys, inspections, the whole bureaucratic dance. Everything had been approved. This is insane, I muttered. But even as I said it, I could see Craig's expression. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to watch. The bulldozer lurched forward another few feet. The operator looked bored, like he demolished people's homes every Tuesday before lunch. You can't just, I started. Actually, we can, Craig interrupted. Emergency demolition clause. When a structure violates county safety codes, immediate action is authorized. He folded the red folder against his chest like armor. Funny thing about permits, James, sometimes they just disappear from the system. That's when I knew this wasn't about building codes. The operator shut off the engine and climbed down, pulling work gloves from his back pocket. He looked at Craig, who checked his watch and nodded. Time's up, Norton. I looked at my little cabin, the place where I'd learned to sleep without Sarah's breathing beside me, where I'd watched countless sunrises over the water, where I'd finally started to feel human again. The morning light was hitting the windows just right, making the whole place glow like something out of a painting. But Craig Mullins was already walking toward the front door, and I realized that in about 60 seconds, I was going to watch my sanctuary get turned into a pile of splinters. What would you do when everything you've rebuilt is about to disappear? The Emergency Homeowner Association meeting was packed tighter than a Sunday service. 50 neighbors crammed into the community center, all of them staring at me like I'd been caught stealing from the church collection plate. Craig stood at the front with a slideshow projector, clicking through photos of my cabin. Each picture showed measurements, angles, violations that supposedly proved my little sanctuary was some kind of menace to society. As you can see, Craig announced, his voice carrying that tone people use when they're explaining something to a particularly slow child, Mr. Norton's structure exceeds the height limitation by 14 inches. 14 inches. I built that place 3 years ago with my own hands, following every specification the county gave me. But there it was on the screen, my roof looking like it was reaching for the sky with criminal intent. I have permits, I said, standing up from the back row. My voice echoed off the walls. Legal permits from 2019. Craig's smile was sharp as a paper cut. Permits that have been revoked due to non-compliance with updated zoning regulations. Mrs. Coleman, my neighbor with a permanently worried expression, whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. I always knew something wasn't right about that place. The murmur that followed felt like a wave of judgment washing over me. These people had been my neighbors for 15 years. I'd helped Coleman fix her fence after the storm last spring. I'd given the Hendersons jumper cables when their car died in the driveway. But now they were looking at me like I was some kind of con artist. The revised building codes clearly state, Craig continued, but I cut him off. Revised when? I never got notice of any changes. All notifications were sent through proper channels, Craig replied smoothly. He clicked to the next slide. Unfortunately, failure to receive official correspondence doesn't absolve property owners of legal obligations. That's when I felt it. The same feeling I'd had watching Sarah's doctors explain why the treatments weren't working. The sense that important decisions about my life were being made by people who saw me as just another file folder. Old Frank Dillon, the neighborhood's retired postal worker, raised his gnarled hand. Craig, I've been walking these streets for 30 years. When exactly were these notifications sent? Craig's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Frank, I appreciate your thoroughness, but official Homeowner Association business follows established protocols. Frank didn't back down. His weathered face crumpled into a frown. That's not an answer, son. The room got quiet. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. The important thing, Craig said, clicking to another slide, is addressing the current violation before it impacts property values for all residents. Property values. There it was. The magic phrase that could turn neighbors into a mob faster than you could say eminent domain. Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously. We can't have unauthorized structures bringing down everyone's investment. Unauthorized? I stood up again, heat rising in my chest. I have every receipt, every inspection report, every signed approval. Which you're welcome to present during the appeals process, Craig said. After the structure is removed, of course. After, like appealing a death sentence after the execution. The bulldozer was still parked outside my cabin, waiting like a patient predator. Through the community center windows, I could see its yellow bulk reflecting the afternoon sun. This is wrong, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to myself. Craig closed his folder with a decisive snap. Sometimes doing what's right isn't easy, James, but rules exist for everyone's protection. As the meeting dissolved into small groups of neighbors discussing how quickly property values might recover, I walked outside into air that felt thick enough to choke on. Frank Dillon caught up with me in the parking lot, his old joints creaking with each step. James, he said quietly, in 30 years of mail delivery, I never missed a house on my route, and I never delivered any building code updates to your address. He patted my shoulder with a hand that had sorted mail through 3 decades of bureaucratic nonsense. Something stinks about this whole thing, he whispered, and it ain't the lake water. But as I drove home past the bulldozer that would be back tomorrow morning, I wondered if knowing something was wrong would be enough to stop it from happening anyway. The next morning, I drove to the county building with a manila folder full of every document I'd ever signed for that cabin. The permits, the inspection reports, the approval letters, everything that proved I'd done this by the book. The county clerk's office smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. Behind the counter sat Jenny Fox, maybe 23 years old, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward her supervisor's door, like she expected trouble to walk through at any second. I need to verify the status of my building permits, I said, sliding my folder across the counter. Someone's telling me they were revoked, but I never got any notice. Jenny's fingers flew across her keyboard, but her expression kept getting more confused with each click. That's strange, she muttered, squinting at her screen. What's strange? Your permits, they're just gone, like they were never issued. She looked up at me with the kind of worry you see on a nurse's face when the test results don't make sense. The system shows empty fields where your approval record should be. I leaned against the counter. That's impossible. I built that place 3 years ago with full county approval. I believe you, Jenny said quickly, glancing again at the supervisor's door. But according to our database, no permits were ever issued for your property. Can you print me what's in the system? Some kind of record that shows what happened? Jenny hesitated, then clicked a few more keys. The printer behind her started warming up, making that mechanical whirring sound that usually means progress. But after 30 seconds, It went silent. "The printer's jammed," she said, but her voice had gone flat. "Happens sometimes. Funny how printers always seem to jam when you need them most." "Maybe try a different printer," I suggested. "They're all connected to the same server. If one's down, they're all down." Jenny's supervisor, a thin man with the dead eyes of someone who'd spent too many years explaining why things couldn't be done, emerged from his office. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking at me like I was something unpleasant he'd found stuck to his shoe. "Just trying to get copies of my building permits," I said. "Our systems are experiencing technical difficulties today," the supervisor replied, without even checking Jenny's computer. "You'll need to come back tomorrow." "Tomorrow, always tomorrow, when you need answers today." "What kind of technical difficulties delete 3-year-old record?" I asked. The supervisor's smile was as warm as a January funeral. "Database maintenance, it happens. Sometimes old files get reorganized." I looked at Jenny, who was staring at her keyboard like it held the secrets of the universe. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Ma'am," I said gently, "can you at least confirm whether permits were ever issued for my address?" "Sir," the supervisor interrupted, "our office hours end in 10 minutes. You'll need to return tomorrow during normal business hours." It was 11:20 a.m. Their hours didn't end until 4:30. A security guard appeared from nowhere. A thick guy with the kind of posture that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. He didn't say anything, just stood there radiating the message that my time was up. "Now this is harassment," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how they sounded, like desperation. Like the kind of thing someone says when they're losing and everyone knows it. "Have a good day, sir," the supervisor said, already turning back toward his office. I walked outside into sunshine that felt like mockery. My truck sat in the parking lot, loaded with 3 years' worth of paperwork that apparently meant nothing to anyone who mattered. The drive home took me past the community center where Craig Mullins was loading boxes into his Mercedes. He saw me coming and actually waved like we were old friends meeting at the grocery store. I rolled down my window. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, James?" he called out. "Hope you got your affairs sorted at the county office." "A funny thing," I replied. "My permits seem to have vanished from their computer system." Craig's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Technology can be unreliable. Good thing we have hard copies of all the important stuff." "We?" "The Homeowner Association keeps our own records, for situations exactly like this." He patted one of the boxes in his trunk. "Sometimes the county folks need a little help remembering what's what." That's when I understood. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. This was orchestrated. But understanding the game and winning it are two very different things. The bulldozer was still parked on my street, patient as death itself. That evening I found myself at the Old Time Tavern, nursing a beer I didn't really want and trying to make sense of a situation that felt like quicksand. The place was dim, smoky, and filled with the kind of people who understood that sometimes life hits you with a sledgehammer when you're expecting a handshake. Tommy Ray was working the bar, 60 years old, built like a tree stump, with eyes that had seen every kind of trouble this town could produce. He'd been pouring drinks here since before I moved to Pinewood Lake, and he had a memory like a steel trap when it came to local gossip. "You look like a man with problems," Tommy said, sliding a fresh beer across the scarred wooden bar. "You could say that." I told him about the permits, the bulldozer, Craig's little performance at the county office. Tommy listened while polishing glasses, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned forward on his thick forearms. "Funny you should mention Craig Mullins," he said quietly. "He was in here yesterday celebrating with some out-of-town fellow, real estate type by the look of him. Expensive suit, fancy watch, the whole package." "Celebrating what?" "That's what caught my attention. They were talking about prime waterfront properties and development opportunities. The stranger kept mentioning something about cleared parcels becoming available soon." Tommy reached under the bar and pulled out a business card. "Guy left this behind when he got up to use the restroom. Thought it might be interesting." I looked at the card. Lakeshore Development Corporation, Premium Waterfront Properties. The pieces clicked together like bullets sliding into a chamber. My cabin wasn't just some building code violation. It was sitting on land that someone wanted for a bigger project. "You happen to remember what else they talked about?" Tommy's grin was sharp as broken glass. The stranger asked Craig how many problem properties they'd identified along the lake. Craig said they were down to just a few stubborn holdouts. Holdouts, like I was some kind of squatter instead of a man who'd bought his land fair and square 15 years ago. There's more, Tommy continued. Craig mentioned something about having friends at the county who could help expedite the process. Said it was amazing how quickly paperwork could disappear when the right people were motivated. I felt that familiar burn in my chest, the same anger I'd carried during Sarah's illness when doctors started talking about quality of life and difficult decisions. The helpless rage of watching powerful people treat your world like it was just another business transaction. Tommy, you willing to remember this conversation if things get complicated? Son, I've been tending bar in this town for 30 years. I remember everything worth remembering, and I don't much like bullies. He polished another glass with deliberate care, especially bullies who think they're smarter than everyone else. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the business card before sliding it back across the bar. Mind if I hang on to this? Consider it a public service. The tavern door opened with a rusty squeal, and Craig Mullins walked in like he owned the place. He scanned the room, spotted me at the bar, and his face lit up with that salesman's smile. James, didn't expect to see you out and about. Thought you'd be busy packing. Just having a drink with my neighbor Tommy here. I raised my beer in a mock toast, discussing local real estate trends. Craig's smile flickered for just a moment. Real estate can be tricky business. Market forces, development pressures, changing regulations. Sometimes properties that seem valuable become liabilities. Liabilities? Structures that don't meet current codes, parcels that interfere with community development, the kind of problems that smart property owners address before they become permanent. Tommy continued polishing glasses, but I could feel his attention sharpening like a knife being honed. And sounds like you know a lot about development in this area, I said casually. I make it my business to stay informed. Homeowner Association presidents need to think about the big picture. Craig ordered a scotch, top shelf naturally. Sometimes individual interests have to give way to community progress. And who decides what counts as progress? Craig's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. The people with vision, James. The people who understand that sentiment can't stand in the way of growth. He finished his drink in 2 swallows, dropped a 20 on the bar, and headed for the door. But before leaving, he turned back. Bulldozer starts work at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. I'd hate for there to be any complications. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the smell of expensive cologne and cheap threats hanging in the air. Tommy looked at me with the expression of a man who'd just watched someone step in front of a freight train. James, that man's got more angles than a geometry textbook, and none of them are straight. But knowing someone's crooked and proving it are 2 very different things, and I had less than 12 hours to figure out which one mattered more. 8 a.m. came with the sound of diesel engines and hydraulic systems warming up. I stood on my cabin's front porch watching Craig Mullins direct his demolition crew like a general commanding troops. He had 3 men with him now, plus a county inspector who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Last chance, Norton," Craig called out. "Anything valuable in there, you better grab it now." I walked down to meet him, carrying the manila folder that had become my constant companion. I want to see the demolition order, the real one, with signatures and dates. Craig pulled out the same red folder from yesterday, but this time he opened it with the theatrical flourish of a magician revealing his best trick. The document inside looked official enough. County letterhead, official seals, the works. But as I read through it, my blood turned to ice water. "This says my cabin was built on public recreation land," I said slowly. "Claims the entire parcel was designated for community use in 1987. "That's right." Craig's voice carried the satisfaction of a man playing a winning hand. "Your family illegally privatized public property. The county's just reclaiming what was always theirs." "That's impossible. I've owned this land since 2008. Clean title, no liens, no restrictions." "Ah, but here's where it gets interesting." Craig produced another document with a flourish. "This is the original 1987 zoning map, clearly showing your parcel as designated public recreation space." The document looked old, official, and completely damning. My property was shaded in green with "public beach access" written across it in block letters. Have you ever felt the ground disappear from under your feet while you're still standing on solid earth? That's what hit me as I stared at that map. The Norton family has been essentially squatting on public land for decades, Craig announced loudly enough for my neighbors to hear. Mrs. Coleman was definitely listening from her kitchen window. The county's being generous by not pursuing criminal charges. This is insane, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to myself. My father bought this land legally in 1985. I have the deed. Deeds can be mistaken, Craig replied smoothly, especially when they conflict with official municipal records. The inspector cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Mullins, I'm going to need to verify this documentation before we proceed. Everything's been verified by the county legal department, Craig cut him off. We're on a tight schedule here. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when it's bad news. I could see them whispering, pointing, making the kind of judgments that stick to you like tar. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. James, if this land really belongs to the community, we want compensation for all these years of illegal use. Compensation? I stared at her in disbelief. Helen, I've been your neighbor for 15 years. And apparently you've been stealing community resources the whole time, she replied coldly. We want our beach access back. The crowd murmured agreement. These people had been to my barbecues, had borrowed my tools, had asked me to watch their houses when they went on vacation. But now they were looking at me like I was some kind of con artist who'd been playing a long game. Craig raised his voice. The Homeowner Association will be filing a civil suit to recover damages for lost community recreation opportunities. We're talking decades of lost value. You can't sue me for owning property I legally purchased. You can't own public land, James, no matter how long you pretend it's yours. The bulldozer operator climbed into his machine and started it up. The engine roar cut through the morning air like a chainsaw through bone. I looked at my little cabin, the place where I'd learned to live without Sarah, where I'd found some measure of peace after losing everything that mattered. In about 10 minutes, it was going to be reduced to splinters and memories. Wait, I called out, but my voice was drowned out by diesel engines and the excited chatter of neighbors who suddenly saw dollar signs in my demolition. Craig Mullins stood there with his arms folded, watching my world crumble with the satisfaction of a man who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. But as I watched him savor his victory, something nagged at the back of my mind. Something about that 1987 zoning map. Something that didn't quite fit. The problem was figuring out what it was before my home became a pile of debris. The bulldozer blade lifted, angled toward my front wall, and I realized I had about 30 seconds left to save everything I'd built from the wreckage of my old life. The emergency homeowner association meeting was Craig's show, and he was playing it like a man who owned the theater. 60 neighbors packed into the community center, all of them there to witness what Craig had billed as the final resolution of the Norton property dispute. I sat in the back row with a manila envelope in my lap, watching Craig work the crowd like a seasoned politician. He had charts, maps, official documents, everything a man needed to look legitimate while destroying his neighbor's life. As you all know, Craig began, we've discovered that James Norton's property has been illegally occupying community recreation land for decades. Tonight, we'll be voting on the Homeowner Association's official response to this violation. Mrs. Coleman raised her hand. What kind of response? Full restitution, Craig replied smoothly. The Norton family will need to compensate the community for 40 years of lost beach access. We're talking about hundreds of thousands in damages. The murmur that went through the room sounded like distant thunder. I could feel 60 pairs of eyes calculating how much my destruction might be worth to their property values. Additionally, Craig continued, we'll be pursuing criminal charges for fraud and theft of community resources. Criminal charges. The man wasn't just trying to take my home. He was trying to put me in prison for the crime of legally owning property. Frank Dillon, the retired mailman, stood up slowly. Craig, I've got a question about these 1987 zoning records. What kind of question, Frank? Well, I've been thinking about mail delivery routes back then. If this land was designated for public use in 1987, wouldn't there have been official notifications sent to all affected property owners? Craig's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Official notifications follow established protocols, Frank. See, that's the thing, Frank continued, his old voice carrying clearly through the room. I remember delivering mail to Robert Norton, James's father, all through the late 80s. Never once delivered any county notifications about zoning changes or public land designation. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Frank had delivered mail in this community for 30 years. If anyone would remember official notifications, it would be him. Memory can be unreliable, Frank, Craig said dismissively, especially after so many years. That's when I stood up. Craig, you mention my father a lot in your documentation. Mind if I share some memories of my own? Craig's expression went carefully neutral. James, this isn't really the time for... Actually, it's exactly the time. I opened my manila envelope and pulled out the first photograph. See, my dad was obsessive about documenting his construction projects, took photos of everything. I walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye in the place tracking my movement. This is from August 1985, I said, holding up the photo of my father and young Craig shaking hands. Dad building the cabin foundation, and here's the county inspector who approved the work. Craig went very still. Funny thing is, I continued, the inspector in this photo looks a lot like someone we all know. Someone who was supposedly unaware that construction was happening on public land. I passed the photo to Mrs. Coleman in the front row. Her eyes widened as she recognized Craig's younger face. That's, she began. Inspector C. Mullins, I said, reading from the back of the photo. Official county building inspector, personally approving construction on land that he now claims has been public property since 1987. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Craig's face had gone ashen, but he tried to rally. Even if I was involved in inspections, that doesn't change the zoning. Oh, but it does. I pulled out the carbon copy of the original permit. Because this is your signature, Craig, your official approval for construction on private land, dated August 15th, 1985, 2 full years before your magical 1987 public designation. I held up photo after photo, Craig measuring property lines, checking foundation work, signing inspection reports, 40 years of evidence that he'd personally certified construction that he now claimed was illegal. So here's my question for everyone, I said, looking around the room. Either Craig was criminally incompetent as a county inspector 40 years ago, or he's lying through his teeth right now about the zoning history of my land. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke up. Craig, is that really you in those pictures? Craig Mullins, Homeowner Association president and local power broker, stood there like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The situation is more complex than these old photos suggest. No, I said quietly. It's actually pretty simple. You approved my father's construction, you certified the land was private, and now you're trying to steal it 40 years later by pretending it was always public property. Frank Dillon started laughing, a dry, rusty sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Craig, son, you've been caught red-handed with your own paperwork. The room erupted into angry voices, questions, demands for explanation. But Craig Mullins just stood there, finally speechless for the first time since I'd known him. Sometimes the past reaches out and grabs the present by the throat. And sometimes justice is just a matter of letting old photographs tell their story. The Homeowner Association meeting dissolved into chaos faster than sugar and rain. Neighbors who'd been ready to sue me an hour earlier were now demanding Craig's resignation. Mrs. Coleman grabbed the photos from my hands, studying Craig's young face like she was memorizing it for a police lineup. 40 years, she said, her voice shaking with anger. 40 years you've been positioning yourself as some kind of community guardian, and you were planning this theft the whole time. Craig tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. There are legal complexities here that require... The only complexity, Frank Dillon interrupted, is figuring out how many laws you've broken. Tommy Ray stood up from the middle of the room, holding up that business card from Lakeshore Development. Want to explain your relationship with these real estate vultures, Craig? The ones you were celebrating with at my bar? The crowd turned toward Tommy like a pack of wolves catching a scent. Craig's face went from pale to gray. I don't know what you're talking about, Craig stammered. Sure you do. Tommy continued. You and that fancy developer planning how to clear out us stubborn holdouts along the lake. Amazing how building permits can just disappear when the right people are motivated. Wasn't that your exact phrase? I watched Craig's carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. For decades, he'd been the man with answers, the one who knew how to work the system. But now, he was just another middle-aged bureaucrat caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The vote, Mrs. Henderson called out suddenly. We need to vote on Craig's removal from the Homeowner Association board. Seconded, came from 3 different voices. All in favor of removing Craig Mullins as association president? Every hand in the room went up, every single one. Craig looked around the room at faces that had respected him, trusted him, followed his leadership for years. Now they were staring at him like he was something unpleasant they'd found stuck to their shoes. This is premature, he said weakly. There should be proper procedures. Like the proper procedures you followed when you tried to steal James's land? Frank Dillon's voice carried the bite of winter wind. Boy, you're done here. Craig gathered his papers with shaking hands, but before he could leave, Tommy Ray stood up again. One more thing, Craig. That developer friend of yours, he might be interested to know that his inside man just got exposed as a fraud. Tends to complicate business relationships. Craig's shoulders sagged like a man carrying the weight of his own collapsed reputation. He walked toward the exit, but stopped at the door. James, he said without turning around, this isn't over. Yeah, it is, I replied. It's been over since 1985. You just forgot you'd already lost. The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Mrs. Coleman approached me with tears in her eyes. James, I owe you an apology. We all do. We were ready to destroy you based on his lies. People make mistakes when they are scared, I said. Craig's good at making people scared. But even as the neighbors apologized, even as they voted to restore my property rights and censure Craig's actions, I felt something hollow in my chest. Victory tastes different when it comes at the cost of trust you'll never fully get back. 3 weeks later, the county quietly restored my building permits. Craig Mullins resigned from all his civic positions and moved to Arizona, where presumably there were new communities to manipulate. Lakeshore Development abandoned their plans for Pinewood Lake development. My cabin still stands by the water, exactly as my father built it and as I've maintained it. The sunrise still looks the same through my kitchen window. The lake still whispers the same secrets to the shoreline. But I learned something about small-town life that I wish I hadn't needed to learn. Sometimes the people you trust with power are the ones who've been planning to use it against you all along. Sometimes neighbors become strangers the moment someone in authority tells them you're the enemy. Frank Dillon still waves when he walks past my place. Tommy Ray still serves me beer and listens to my problems. Mrs. Coleman brought me cookies last week and apologized again for doubting me. But there's a distance now that wasn't there before. A carefulness in conversations. A hesitation in friendships. The cost of winning isn't always losing. Sometimes it's the knowledge that you can't go back to not knowing what you know. I still live in my little cabin by the lake, still watch the sunrise, still remember Sarah and the quiet moments. But now I also remember that home isn't just a place you build. It's a community that chooses to let you belong. And sometimes that choice can be taken away faster than you'd ever believe possible. Have you ever won a fight and wondered if the victory was worth what it cost you? That's the question I ask myself every morning when I drink my coffee on the porch that Craig Mullins tried to destroy. The answer changes with the weather, but the cabin still stands. And sometimes that has to be enough.